Iron horses and paper fortunes, Railway Mania 1840s. It is the autumn of 1845. The reading rooms of Britain are wallpapered with prospectuses. Every newspaper, the Times, the Railway Chronicle, the Railway Record, a dozen others launched specifically to cover the boom, is running advertisements for new railway companies. Dozens of them. Every week, every single week, there are new lines, new routes, new opportunities to invest in the technology that is reshaping the world. And Britain is investing. Not just the wealthy, not just the merchant class. Factory workers are putting in their savings. School teachers are mortgaging their futures. The Brontë sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, living in their parsonage in Haworth, have invested money in the York and Midland Railway. In the corridors of Parliament, something extraordinary is happening. Members of Parliament are supposed to evaluate railway bills on their merits, their engineering soundness, their economic viability, their public benefit. But in 1845, so many members of Parliament hold shares in railway companies that the process of scrutiny has become largely theoretical. They are not evaluating investment proposals. They are voting on their own portfolios. In one extraordinary session, Parliament approved 272 separate railway acts, authorizing 9,500 miles of new track in a single year, in a country that already had a functioning rail network. 9,500 miles of track, most of which the country did not need, the terrain could barely accommodate, and the investors could not afford to build. At the center of it all is a man named George Hudson, a linen draper's apprentice from Yorkshire who inherited a small fortune from a great-uncle, parlayed it into railway investments, and through a combination of genuine vision, political cunning, and increasingly desperate financial manipulation, made himself the most powerful businessman in Britain. They call him the Railway King. He controls nearly a third of all operating rail lines in England. He dines with the Duke of Wellington. He is twice elected Lord Mayor of York. Members of Parliament compete for his company, and almost everything he has built, the profits he has distributed, the dividends he has paid, the empire he has assembled, is, in ways that nobody has yet looked at closely enough, built on fraud. The technology is real. The transformation is real. The railways will reshape Britain and eventually the world. But the investment is a different story entirely. Welcome to Market Mayhem, when greed meets gravity. I'm your host. Today, the bubble that proves, more completely than any other in history, that a revolutionary technology and a catastrophic investment can be exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Episode 4. Let's begin. To understand the railway mania, you first have to understand what railways actually were. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, the world's first intercity passenger railway, powered by steam locomotives. On its opening day, the Prime Minister attended. The crowds were enormous, and one man, a member of Parliament named William Hudson, stepped off the track at the wrong moment and was struck by Stephenson's rocket, becoming the first railway fatality in history. Even the opening day had drama, but the impact of railways was genuinely, profoundly revolutionary. Before the railway, the fastest a human being could reliably travel overland was the speed of a horse. Information moved at the speed of a courier. Perishable goods spoiled on roads that had been barely improved since the Romans built them. A journey from London to Edinburgh took 2 days by coach in good conditions. In bad conditions, considerably longer. In winter, sometimes not at all. The railway compressed all of that. London to Edinburgh in 8 hours. Fresh fish from the coast to London markets overnight. Industrial goods moving at costs that made entirely new business models viable. The railway didn't just change transportation. It changed the geography of the economy. It changed what was possible. By the early 1840s, roughly 2,000 miles of railway were operating in Britain, and they were demonstrating profits. Real profits. Shareholders in the early trunk lines, the Great Western, the London and Birmingham, the Midland, were receiving genuine dividends from genuine operations. The railways worked. They made money. The investment case was real. And that reality, that genuine, documented, dividend-paying reality, was the seed of the mania. Because if the early lines are profitable, then more lines must also be profitable. And if more lines are profitable, then even more lines must be more profitable still. The logic seemed sound. It was catastrophically wrong. The early trunk lines were profitable because they connected large population centers that had no alternative. London to Birmingham, Liverpool to Manchester. They carried enormous volumes of passengers and freight and had no competition. Their economics worked because they were natural monopolies serving genuine demand. The 5,000 new lines proposed during the mania were very different animals. They connected smaller towns. They duplicated existing routes. They crossed terrain that would cost fortunes to engineer. Many of them were proposed not because their promoters had identified genuine demand, but because there was money available, and the appetite for railway shares was insatiable. Into this environment stepped George Hudson. He had been investing in railways since the late 1830s, shrewdly, aggressively, and with a talent for consolidation that the fragmented early railway industry genuinely needed. He merged competing lines. He negotiated with Parliament. He understood, better than almost anyone, how to manage the politics of railway building in an era when every new line required an act of Parliament. He also understood something more dangerous, that in a mania, what investors want most is confidence. And confidence could be manufactured, even when the underlying numbers didn't support it. By 1844, the mania had reached escape velocity. New railway companies were being floated at a rate that overwhelmed any rational analysis. Investors who had watched early railway shareholders collect consistent dividends were desperate to replicate the experience. But the best routes were gone. What was left were the speculative ones, the duplicates, the optimistic projections, the engineering challenges that would prove either heroic or ruinous. None of that mattered. The prospectuses all told the same story: revolutionary technology, growing demand, projected returns that made the imagination swim. And every prospectus had a list of directors, prominent men, ideally with a title or two, whose names were supposed to substitute for due diligence. The subscription lists opened and filled within hours, sometimes within minutes. People who couldn't get allocation in one prospectus immediately subscribed to the next. There was a physical infrastructure of mania: railway solicitors, railway engineers, railway surveyors, railway newspapers, and railway agents who moved through the country selling shares to anyone who had money and could be persuaded that they would regret not buying. The Brontë sisters subscribed £500, a very significant sum for 3 unmarried women living on modest means in a Yorkshire parsonage. Charlotte wrote anxiously to her friends about the investment. She was not naive. She was not reckless. She was a rational person in a rational time, doing what every rational person around her was doing. The members of Parliament who were supposed to evaluate these schemes with detached judgment held shares in so many railway companies that the committee rooms of Westminster had effectively become a market. Select committees examined engineering plans and traffic projections, while their members mentally calculated what approval would do to their own holdings. In 1845, Parliament passed 272 railway acts, authorizing 9,500 miles of new track. The total capital committed across all the schemes, approved, proposed, and awaiting approval, was estimated at somewhere between 200 million and 500 million pounds. In an economy where the entire national income was roughly 500 million pounds per year, this was not incremental investment. This was a society betting its future on steam. And at the peak of it all, George Hudson held court. He was not physically imposing, stout, red-faced, with the blunt manner of a man who had started with nothing and had never quite disguised it. But he moved through the grandest rooms in England with absolute assurance. He had made shareholders rich. He continued making shareholders rich. His companies paid dividends while others were still building. His ability to deliver returns, quarter after quarter, year after year, made him the most trusted man in British finance. What nobody outside his inner circle yet knew was how he was delivering those returns. He was paying dividends from capital, taking money raised from new investors and distributing it as profits to old ones, manufacturing the appearance of profitability in companies that were still burning cash. It was not a sustainable accounting strategy. It was not a legal one. But for now, everyone was getting paid, and no one was asking questions. It is the autumn of 1845, and the first crack appears not in any spectacular collapse, but in a newspaper. The Times begins running articles questioning railway valuations. Journalists start asking uncomfortable questions about specific companies, their projected revenues, their actual traffic numbers, the engineering costs that are coming in far above estimates. The articles are not warmly received by the railway press, but they are read. In October 1845, the Bank of England raises interest rates. The effect is immediate and clarifying. When money is cheap, speculative assets attract capital because there is nowhere better for it to go. When money gets more expensive, investors start calculating whether the risk is worth the return. And the calculations, for many of these railway companies, are not reassuring. The subscription lists that had filled within hours now begin to struggle. Shares that had been changing hands at premiums begin trading at par, then below par. The problem is structural and devastating. Under the Railway Acts, investors hadn't paid the full price of their shares up front. They had put down a deposit, often 10%, with calls to follow as the railway required capital to actually build. In a rising market, those calls were manageable. In a falling market, they became catastrophic. As share prices fell below the price at which calls had been made, investors were being asked to pay more for shares than the market said they were worth. Many simply refused to pay. Others, facing ruin, tried to sell. But in a market where everyone was trying to sell simultaneously and nobody was buying, there was no exit. By 1847, the collapse was general and pitiless. Hundreds of railway companies suspended operations. Contractors who had begun building lines went bankrupt when the capital calls stopped coming. Banks that had lent against railway shares faced catastrophic losses. A financial crisis that had begun in the railway sector spread through credit markets across the economy. And George Hudson? In 1849, a committee of shareholders in the York, Newcastle, and Berwick Railway begins auditing his accounts. What they find is systematic fraud extending back years, dividends paid from capital, land purchases concealed, contracts awarded to himself at inflated prices. The accounting manipulation required to maintain the fiction of continuous profitability had been extraordinary in its ambition and its recklessness. Hudson does not go to prison. The legal framework for prosecuting corporate fraud of this nature is still being developed, but he is utterly destroyed. His wealth is seized by creditors. His political career evaporates. His social position collapses with such velocity that people who had competed to dine with the railway king now cross the street to avoid him. He eventually flees to France to escape his debts. the most powerful businessman in Britain, the man who had dined with dukes and corresponded with royalty, ends his public life hunted by the investors he had enriched and then betrayed. The Brontë sisters lose most of their investment. The aftermath of the railway mania is, in one sense, a catalogue of individual catastrophe. Thousands of investors ruined, families broken, the middle-class savings of a generation partially or wholly destroyed. But the aftermath also contained something the earlier bubbles mostly lacked. The technology was real. The railways that survived the crash, the ones that connected genuine demand centers on viable routes with sound engineering, went on to transform Britain and then the world. The Great Western Railway still runs today, substantially along the routes laid down in the 1840s. The trunk lines that George Stephenson and Isambard Kingdom Brunel built were engineering masterpieces that outlasted everyone who had speculated on them. This is the peculiar cruelty of technology bubbles. The technology wins. The investors, very often, lose. The people who invested in railways in 1844 and 1845 and 1846 were not wrong about railways. They were wrong about valuations, wrong about specific companies, wrong about the timeline, wrong about the competitive dynamics, and very often wrong about the honesty of the people managing their money. The same pattern, technology works. Most investments in it don't. Repeated exactly in the dot-com boom of the late 1990s. The internet changed the world. Amazon, Google, and a handful of others became the most valuable companies in history. The investors who bought Pets.com and Webvan and 1,000 other burning cash disasters lost everything. The Nasdaq fell 78% and took 15 years to recover. It would repeat again in the electric vehicle boom, in the clean energy rush, in the early AI frenzy. Real technology, real transformation, catastrophic overvaluation of almost every specific investment made during the mania. The parliamentary reforms that followed the railway mania were significant. Committees were reformed to prevent conflicts of interest. Accounting standards for public companies began to develop. The fraud that Hudson perpetrated would have been harder to sustain under later Victorian regulation. The disasters of the 1840s contributed indirectly to the Companies Act of 1862, which codified limited liability and created the framework for modern corporate law. And George Hudson, in his disgrace, served a purpose that his success never could. He showed that spectacular returns require examination, not admiration. That a man paying consistent dividends while everyone else is struggling deserves suspicion, not deference. That the question, how is he making this money, is never less important than in the moments when you most want to stop asking it. He was, in the end, a warning that nobody listened to, because warnings are always less compelling than returns. The railway mania teaches 3 lessons that are directly applicable to any market, in any era, that involves a genuinely transformative technology. The first is a method lesson, and it is the most important one this episode has to offer. Transformative technology and profitable investment are not the same thing. They can coexist, but they can also diverge completely, and they do so most violently, precisely when the technology is most obviously real and most obviously important. Railways changed the world. Most railway shares went to zero. The internet changed the world. Most .com shares went to zero. Artificial intelligence is changing the world right now. The companies that survive and compound will be extraordinary investments. The companies that are riding the wave of enthusiasm without viable economics, the ones whose prospectus is essentially a story about participating in something revolutionary. Those are the railway mania investments of our generation. The discipline required is brutal. Separate the technology from the company. The technology can be real, and the company can still be worthless. Ask the same questions you would ask of any business. What are the revenues? What is the path to profitability? What does the competitive landscape look like in 5 years when everyone has built their own version of this? What is the actual evidence that this specific company, rather than the sector in general, will capture the returns? The second lesson is a money lesson about calls and commitments. Railway investors didn't lose just what they had invested. They lost what they had promised to invest. The call structure, deposit now, pay the rest later, meant that falling markets didn't just destroy their existing investment. It created additional obligations that they had no capacity to meet. Leveraged positions in volatile markets work exactly the same way. Know your maximum exposure before you enter, not after. The third is a mind lesson about charisma and returns. George Hudson was the most trusted man in British finance. He delivered returns, quarter after quarter, year after year. He had the confidence of the smartest people in the country. He was wrong and fraudulent, and his accounts were a fiction. Returns without transparency are not evidence of skill. A manager who consistently outperforms in ways that nobody quite understands deserves more scrutiny, not less. In every generation, there is a George Hudson. Someone who delivers while others struggle, who inspires the kind of admiration that makes asking questions feel rude. Ask anyway, especially then. Especially when the returns are spectacular and the explanation is vague. The technology was real. The locomotives ran. The tunnels held. The bridges spanned rivers that had never been bridged before. The railways changed Britain and then the world. They compressed geography, built national economies, made things possible that had been impossible for the entire history of human civilization. And thousands of investors went broke. The Brontë sisters lost most of their money. George Hudson lost everything, including his dignity, and fled to France. The members of Parliament who had voted on schemes in which they held shares emerged from the wreckage with their wealth diminished and their reputation for competence permanently damaged. The lesson is not that technology is a bad investment. The lesson is that in the middle of a genuine technological revolution, the question, is this technology real, is almost never the right question. The right question is this specific company, at this specific price, with these specific economics, a good investment? And that question requires the same rigorous answer in a railway boom as in a quiet market. It requires the same answer about artificial intelligence stocks as about groceries. The excitement doesn't change the math. The revolution doesn't change the requirement for a viable business. Next time on Market Mayhem, we go to 1929, the Roaring Twenties, margin lending, Black Tuesday, and the greatest trader who ever lived, Jesse Livermore, who shorted the crash and made $100 million, then lost it all and chose to end his own life. Black Tuesday, the day America stopped believing. Episode 5. If today's story made you think about where you separate technology excitement from investment discipline, take the free mind, method, money assessment at CompleteTradersEdge.com/assessment. Find out which pillar of your trading needs the most work. Links in the description. Subscribe so you don't miss the next disaster.